Thank you, Cian Corla. The government and Minister Kelly clearly had their very best Malcolm Tuckers working on their presentation of the new water charges regime. I think their master plan was to decide to appeal to reasonable people. I guess the thinking is, who doesn't think of themselves as reasonable? I mean, accused of being a kidnapper by the Taoiseach, a ringleader by the Taoiseach, akin to ISIS by Deputy Coonan of Fine Gael. Even I consider myself to be a reasonable person, so it was good thinking to appeal to the reasonable section of society. But a reasonable person is someone with sound judgment. What are they going to make of this plan? I think a reasonable person will notice that all of the talk of conservation is now gone for 4 years. We have a flat rate, regressive home tax, where a multi-millionaire household will pay exactly the same as a household with 1 or 2 people unemployed, where the bottom 10% of our society in terms of income, with a disposable income of €8,500, will spend almost 2% of their disposable income on the water charges, whereas the top 10% will spend just 0.1% of their disposable income. A reasonable person will notice that this is a purely temporary measure, after which an average family will pay more in water charges than they would have under the old regime. So with the withdrawal of the 30,000 litre household allowance, the annual cost for 1 year for a single adult household will now be €200 from 2019, whereas under the old regime, it would have been €117 based on 148 litres per person per day, the Department of Environment figures for the Dublin region. For a 2-adult family, €400 as opposed to the €380 previously. A reasonable person will see that we have an absolutely empty promise about privatisation. I mean, the government is promising legislation to provide for a plebiscite before any future privatisation. That legislation could obviously be repealed by any future Dáil, or a plebiscite could simply be ignored by any future government. Every reasonable person, using their sound judgment, will surely think about where they've heard these sorts of arguments, these sorts of promises before, and it will remind people of the bin charges. Exactly the same stuff was said, and what happened? The waivers went, the prices went up, and the bin services were disastrously privatised at the expense of workers, for example, the workers in Greyhound, and at the expense of consumers. So the reasonable people who do not want water charges that people simply cannot afford, who do not want privatisation, those reasonable people know we have to stop water charges now, we have to end Irish water. We have to stop the commodification of our water, regardless of what the price it comes in at. Once it's commodified, that basic human need, that basic human right, well then the prices will go up and it'll be privatised. And so what those reasonable people need to do, and I think they will do, is to join the We Won't Pay demonstration on the 29th of December, to join the massive Right to Water protest on the 10th of December, and above all, to prepare for, to argue for, to organise for a massive boycott that will sink these charges, like the poll tax was sunk in Britain, that simultaneously sunk Maggie Thatcher, and like the water charges were sunk here in the 1990s. At the moment, the airwaves are filled with the government all of a sudden recognising that you have a chronic underinvestment in water infrastructure, as in many aspects of our infrastructure as a society. And this government and Fianna Fáil, they share the responsibility for that. They've been the ones in power over the last decades who chose not to invest and instead to do all the other things, such as bailing out bondholders, such as offering almost tax-free existence for the likes of Apple, Google, Facebook, and all the rest. But now the magic answer is this off-balance sheet. And they just say it, they try to blind people with science that somehow there's free money coming about because something is off-balance sheet. There's no free money because it's off-balance sheet. It'll be a publicly owned company until it's privatised, and any loan that's taken out will have to be paid for, and it'll have to be paid for by us through water charges. There is no extra free money coming about because you place it off-balance sheet. It's purely an accounting trick. Look at the elements of the market corporation test, which says that sellers have to act to maximise their profits in the long term. So to pass the market corporation test, which the government is committed to do, Irish Water has to be a profit maximising entity, which means trying to raise the prices. It means trying to do whatever it possibly can to raise more money from people. Finally, I want to come to the subject of the protest in Jobestown on Saturday, which has been the subject of such overblown attacks here in the chamber today and right across the media. Those attacks, we should remember, did not start on Saturday with Jobestown. They started about 2 weeks previously, with the talk of the sinister fringe, with the talk of dissident elements interfering with protests. They are the conscious stick to go along with the baby carrot that Minister Kelly announced yesterday. It's a conscious tactic to demonise protesters, to frighten people away from attending on the 10th of December, to frighten people away from getting involved in campaigning against water charges. But what we had on Saturday was a protest organised by local residents, overwhelmingly women. Contrary to the mistruths told in this chamber, the graduates of An Cusain were not jeered or shouted at, but were cheered and applauded by those protesting. There was a peaceful protest of hundreds of people, a sit-down protest, a slow march of people expressing their anger. And what we've had in the media is a disgraceful attempt to denigrate those protesters and, in my opinion, to denigrate the people of Jobestown and of Tallaght. At the fore of that denigration is independent newspapers. And it isn't an accident that Denis O'Brien has a commercial interest in protests against water meters, which he's imposing, being denigrated. Just like it wasn't an accident whenever Shelter C protesters were denigrated by independent newspapers, then controlled by Tony O'Reilly. Just like it wasn't an accident when the workers of 1913 were denigrated by independent newspapers, then controlled by William Martin Murphy. This is what the media does, and this is what the establishment does. And we've heard all these deputies from the establishment party saying they're all for protest. All of a sudden, they all participated in loads of protests in their lives, but they're just for peaceful protest. But every single time you have a movement that threatens the rule of the establishment, you have denigration, demonisation of protests by the establishment and the media. Yes, people are angry, and they have every right to be angry. And yes, this is about more than just water charges. It's about cuts to child benefit, it's about cuts to rent allowance, it's about the destruction of people's lives over the past 6 years. But above all, it's about the mass of people becoming involved in politics. And that's what concerns the establishment. That's why the word mob is used. Because it's the idea that people should just engage in politics at election time. Just be voting fodder for the likes of the Labour Party and then sit back, allow them to betray all their promises. But that's changed, and that's what has the government so scared. I just want to finish with a short quote from James Connolly, where he said, "At last, with the development of manufacturing came the gathering together of the mob, and consequent knowledge of its numbers and power, and with the gathering together also came the possibility of acquiring education. Then the mob started upon its upward march to power, a power only to be realised in the Socialist Republic. In the course of that upward march, the mob has transformed and humanised the world. It has abolished religious persecution and imposed toleration upon the bigots of all creeds. It has established the value of human life, softened the horrors of war as a preliminary to abolishing it, compelled trial by jury, abolished the death penalty for all offences save one, and in some countries abolished it for all." And he goes on. All hail then to the mob, the incarnation of progress. Thank you.